My name is Pastor Joshua Berg. I'm the minister at Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. Today's presentation is a workshop on what's called narrative improv, and this training was based on the work developed by clinicians at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. What it is it puts the discipline of narrative medicine, which is a rather new discipline, in conversation with improvisation in order to train medical caregivers and spiritual caregivers through the lens of cultural humility. So, although this is a teaching, a pedagogical, is it pedagogical? Either one, you know what I mean, resource. This workshop isn't necessarily to teach, it rather is to offer a tool so that these clinicians and these service providers can develop skills to increase the ability to see and to hear and to connect with patients and their families with different backgrounds and with different beliefs and with different experiences, different cultures, etc. How to hold space, how to bear witness, give them practice in being as present as possible in the clinical encounter. And through this workshop, the hope is that it enables the caregiver to truly hear what the care receiver, what others are valuing, and as well as enhancing the caregiver's own self-awareness and their ability to deeply listen in order to center equity and center a partnership, create a true partnership with patients and families. So the workshop begins with the narrative medicine exercises, and then moves into the improv exercises, and then moves back to bring things together. And you don't have to be familiar with narrative medicine, and you don't have to be familiar with improv to do this workshop. It is meant for, like I said, medical care providers and spiritual care providers, clinicians who have no experience in either. To quote Dr. Rita Sharon, who is widely regarded as the creator of the narrative medicine discipline, or one of the originators and developers of this discipline, and it exists now, I believe, at USC and Columbia universities. But Dr. Sharon said, so narrative medicine is essentially a clinical practice fortified by the knowledge of what to do with stories. It's not a book club. It provides care by understanding and facilitating another's story. Narrative medicine is meant to connect providers with what's important about their own work and how to communicate that in community. It hopefully develops a deeper attention to the text of a person's story, a text of their own story, and to ground the conversation there in both stories and where they overlap. It's meant to help practice paying attention together, the caregiver and the care receiver. There is essentially a common text that's established, and within that common text, taking into account your own story and the care receiver's story and your identity and their identity, you create a common text to talk about usually uncomfortable topics. The first narrative medicine exercise is called the poem exercise. And what happens is the leader chooses a poem. The one that we used at Children's Hospital was the same one every time. It was called If You Knew by Ellen Bass. In different workshops, I've also used Coal by Audre Lorde and Us by Tori Dent, but you can use any of those or you can pick your own poem. The leader chooses the poem, and then the leader reads the poem once through and asks participants to consider and or write down. You provide paper and pencil, write down anything that is meaningful to them. And this could be anything. It could be words, it could be phrases, it could be ideas, it could be sentiments, it could be images that pop into your head. Anything that pops into your head or that's in the text of the poem. Usually each participant will have a copy of the poem so they can look at it as the leader reads it. And then they get a few minutes to write these things down if they want to write something down. And then the leader asks another person to read the poem, because this is also about hearing words in other people's voices. And another person reads the poem, and again, the participants continue that process of considering what is meaningful to them and writing it down if they want to. And you have a few minutes to process this.
What if you knew you'd be the last to touch someone? If you were taking tickets, for example, at the theater, tearing them, giving back the ragged stubs, you might take care to touch that palm. Brush your fingertips along the lifeline's crease. When a man pulls his wheeled suitcase too slowly through the airport, when the car in front of me doesn't signal, when the clerk at the pharmacy won't say, "Thank you," I don't remember they're going to die. A friend told me she'd been with her aunt. They'd just had lunch, and the waiter, a young gay man with plum black eyes, joked as he served the coffee, kissed her aunt's powdered cheek when they left. Then they walked half a block, and her aunt dropped dead on the sidewalk. How close does the dragon's spume have to come? How wide does the crack in heaven have to split? What would people look like if we could see them as they are, soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless, pinned against time?
Thank you. So then when this is finished, when people have written down their thoughts and their feelings and their reactions and their emotions to the poem after it's been read twice, the leader will then moderate a discussion, and people can participate or not, and most often they do, on which the participants comment on what moved them. They could read what they wrote down, they can say anything that comes to mind, and then the leader facilitates that by talking about how what they're saying relates to patient care, spiritual care, through the lens of cultural humility.
Hi, Crack in Heaven took me to the whole idea of, the spirit world versus the real world.
Yeah.
And the idea of a crack in that world. Are there people that maybe can sense those cracks? That made me think of Samhain, the Celtic holiday when the veil between the two worlds thins, and spirits can come back and forth.
Yeah.
That was kind of, I don't know, for some reason that was where it took me.
And that's great. When we think about these existential things, crack in heaven, life and death, it often comes up our cultural references, our cultural connections, like yours. And you're going to have one, and a patient is probably going to have a completely different one, but they're going to overlap in some ways. And the trick is to find where and how they overlap, while respecting theirs and communicating yours. So thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
I wrote down a couple things. One, that touch and connection is important, and that we or people need to know that they're seen. We so much take that kind of thing for granted.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, someone isn't around, and we realize that all we had to do was just reach out for a moment. and that could have made so much difference in someone's life.
Yeah. And reach out and touch, those are the words you're using, but that could mean many different things. If someone can't touch, if someone is sick or you can't get near them, you can still reach out and connect to them in that moment. Thank you. Anybody else? John?
Well, the words care and carefully, I thought all will die, and to live minute by minute in care and love, and leave anger behind, which is a personal challenge. The phrase dragon spume to crack our hard shell, because we all have the hard shell.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know not what will happen next, and we are all pinned by time.
Awesome. And you said, leaving anger behind is so difficult. And this is part of reading this and thinking about it, is knowing that when you're in a situation where you've done 2 overnight shifts as a nurse and you're confronting a patient, it's very difficult to leave frustration behind. It's almost impossible, but you still can't take it out on the patient. So, thank you. Yeah, dragon spume. I loved it. Anyone else? We'll do one or we can 1 or 2 more, and then we'll move on.
The words that came to me were reverence, blessing, and a phrase that came to me was a very caring touch.
Yeah. Awesome. Isn't it interesting how we hear, John heard dragon spume and you heard reverence and blessing in the same poem. And when we speak to someone in a room, we're going to pick things out. We're going to hear things that they say, and they're going to hear things that we say, and they may not be the things that we expected them to hear or they expected us to hear. That's part of really deep listening to ourselves and to others. Awesome, thank you. So the next narrative medicine prompt, and the next writing prompt, the next exercise, narrative medicine exercise, the leader provides a writing prompt. And the prompt itself is meant as a vector of sorts. It's neither meant to be restraining or compelling in any way. It's just a direction. After given this writing prompt, participants are given 5-7 minutes or so to write, once again, anything that the prompt inspires, and they can write in any form. It can be abstract, it can be lyrical, it can be rhyming, it can be narrative, it can be random words, they can draw pictures. Really write down and respond, ideally with the written word, in any way that moves them to this prompt. A couple of the prompts that are often used, and ones that I use, first are, talk about a time when someone truly witnessed you for who you are, truly recognized you for who you are. That's one of the prompts, and then they would write about that. Alternatively, I've used in spiritual care, specifically spiritual care settings, and not medical settings, I've used the prompt, what do you consider to be divine? What is the divine mean to you? What is the divine to you? And then, once again, you give the participants time to write down and reflect, if that's what they want to do. And then you once again facilitate a discussion. You offer that a few people read what they wrote. Not everyone has to read what they wrote, maybe 1, 2, or 3 people. And then you facilitate a discussion about what they wrote could mean in the theater of spiritual care or medical care, through the taking into account cultural humility.
So I'm remembering a time a few years ago when I joined a healers circle in Orange County, and when I arrived there, I was too afraid to bring in any of my healing modalities.
Yeah.
And I told them I had no gifts.
Oh, wow.
And the very next time I met with them, they said, we have a special guest, and he is going to share his gifts with you, whatever they are.
Wow.
And it was just beautiful to be seen as somebody that just kind of wanted to be seen,
Yeah.
and to be given a chance to show. And
Yeah.
I never didn't offer something from that day on.
That's amazing. And that's the thing, especially in a stress, that you were stressed in an environment where it was meant to share, it was meant to heal. you're in the hospital, and your relative is sick or dying, or you're stressed, or you're worried about insurance or money or whatever, it's even more difficult to share anything. So when a hospital worker comes in and really wants to hear your truth, wants to hear your story, makes it comfortable for you to the extent that's possible to really, for you to believe that they are going to hear you, that they're going to validate you, that you're going to share with them and it's okay. It's so healing. And it opens up the ability for, like you said, every other time you share it again, it opens up the ability to continue sharing with that hospital worker. Thank you. How about it? Does anyone else want to? Yeah, Grant.
So what I wrote was this. I felt as I truly am in the silence when there were no words or concepts that placed expectations on my actions, when I talked and there was no response, but I heard understanding. And that is what I thought about and felt when I had a therapist that I really connected with, and I was able to talk about all my problems, and they mostly just listened.
It's interesting you say that. One of the things we learn how to do, and it's not easy as a spiritual caregiver myself, is the ministry of presence and the ministry of silence. Those are so important, those tools, to be able to sit in silence and allow another person to share and feel comfortable sharing. I met with a patient one time, I remember, and I won't tell you the situation, but it was very, very bad. And we sat there for 3 hours, and like you said, that person just opened up and just felt, I felt safe talking to me, I hope, because they talked for almost the entire 3 hours. I didn't say anything, almost nothing. And at the end, they said, wow, this was so healing. I so appreciate this conversation. And I'm thinking, I didn't say anything at all. And my own therapist too. I usually use the time to just talk about my issues, and in a space where you can do that and someone's not going to judge you. How healing and powerful is that? Thank you.
I think that it's interesting how I think that you're right, and also it's interesting the way that time and grief and trauma that comes around grief affects memory.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been a long exploration to try and bring back memories good memories that have gone away because of trauma and grief.
That's such a challenge. That's so real. Trauma and grief can do so many powerful things that we can't even imagine. And this is why, as caregivers, when we connect with our own, we realize when we see a patient going through trauma and grief and experiencing things we never would have imagined, we realize how powerful those feelings are. Next, we go into the improv part of this workshop. I begin by talking about what improv is. Some people usually know what it is. Most often people aren't 100% sure they know what it is. And essentially, in its simplest terms, it's theater built in real time. And I asked the participants to think again of the improv space as the text going forward, almost like the narrative medicine part. We actually had a text and they wrote a text. The improv space here will be the text that we'll analyze and that we'll learn from. And as in a healthcare or a spiritual care setting, it involves generous listening. You don't know what's going to happen in the next moment. And it is, of course, always collaborative. Next, I go into what are the tenets of improv. and I go through each one, and I start with the one most people are familiar with, which is the yes and, the generosity of yes and. And I'll talk about how yes and doesn't mean that there isn't any disagreement necessarily. It's just you're respecting another's choices. You're taking another's input and you're building together. You're not rejecting what the other person says. You may not agree with it, but you're not rejecting it. Two people in a room and one goes to the other one and says, "Oh, you have beautiful wings on your back." You're not saying, "No, I'm a person, I don't have beautiful wings." You're saying, "Oh, yes, I just had them refeathered," or whatever. And you have a beautiful tail on you. And that's, how it goes. Yes and means two things can be present at the same time. And I give the example in a clinical setting, which I'll put up here. And I'm not going to go through it, but you can read it. And basically, it's a radiation oncologist invalidating what a person says, and the yes and option would be something more validating. Then I go into the rest of the tenets. There is the second one is the space between you. Just to remember, you're always in partnership. You are in improv and you are in the clinical setting. The third is being with uncertainty. As I mentioned before, there's no script. You don't know what's going to happen. You can plan as much as you want. You can go into a patient's room and something completely unexpected happens. So it's the same with improv. You're sitting with uncertainty. The fourth tenet is accept the gifts that are given. So you want to, as in the clinical care setting, remain open and remain present with the care receiver, and in improv with your partner, and remain open with yourself too. Be vulnerable, and know that whatever they're giving is a gift. And a lot of times, especially in spiritual care setting or medical setting, the gift they're giving you is anger and is frustration, but that's still a gift. That's still them communicating to you what they're feeling, what they need, what they're thinking, and trusting you with that emotion. So that is still a gift. The last tenet is the responsibility for 50%. So the way that it's been put is, in improv, is you are 100% responsible for 50% of the interaction. You have to trust yourself for what you're responsible for. Don't rest the responsibility for the whole conversation on the other person. You really have to participate in a significant way. And you are the bravest clinician when you're trusting yourself. So be yourself. Don't worry about perfection or being something else other than you are. Just be yourself. And that's how it is in improv. You don't worry about being funny. Be yourself. Now, the first exercise that I usually do, and you can do these in any order, is called Name That Emotion. So I have the participants line up in two lines. And so one person is facing one person and the next person is facing the next person. So it's single file down the line, and there's pairs facing each other all the way along. And the two lines don't have to be even, because they're actually, when they finish, they're going to switch places and take the other person's role. So person A is, one line is assigned person A and the other line is assigned person B. And then person A will choose an emotion and whisper it to the facilitator. Or what I most often do is, most people want me to choose the emotion for them. So I'll choose it and I'll have a bunch of emotions written down, pre-written down, and I'll just point to the one so that I'm certain the other person can't hear. And I start out with simpler emotions and then I get more complex. And then person A is going to communicate that emotion to person B through any and everything they care to bring to that. So it could be body language, it could be tone, it could be speed, it could be volume. They're going to communicate that to the other person, but they're only going to say two words. They're going to say hello in the other person's name. Hello, Joshua. And they're going to communicate that emotion honestly in those 2 words. It shouldn't be over the top. It shouldn't be play acting. It should be really trying to feel that emotion. So if the emotion is anger, it would be, hello, Joshua. If it's happy, it'll be, hello, Joshua. Just as honestly as possible, and only using those 2 words. And then the other person will take it in and say back to them, hello, and their name, let's say Judy. Hello, Judy, you seem, and then name the emotion. And really just use those words. A lot of people will start to get off into saying, oh, it really feels like you're trying to this and that and the other. No, as simple as possible. And you can stop them if they go off and just say, hello, name, you seem bored, or whatever they're guessing the emotion is.
Hello, Megan.
Hello, Jean. You sound surprised.
Hello, John.
Hello, Patrick. You seem really angry.
If the emotion named is not the emotion that was told to the person A, then person A will say hello, name again, and try to communicate the emotion again. Maybe this time using a little bit different body language or different voice or different tone. And it's actually interesting because, people come with different abilities. Some people can't hear, some people can't see, some people don't read body language as well, et cetera, et cetera. So you really have to communicate to the person you're talking to. And so if they don't get it, they'll say hello again, and the respondent will say hello, name, you seem. If they still don't get it a second time, person A will say it again, a third time, hello, name in that emotion, and then you'll open it up to the rest of the group to guess. Does anyone else want to guess?
Disappointed.
Oh, what is it?
Irritated.
Irritated. Okay.
Hello, Jeff. Hello, Jeff.
I'm
Does anyone else want to try and guess?
disgusted.
Wow, that's awesome.
Hello, Fran. Hello, Fran.
Hello, Megan. You sound kind of friendly.
So the important thing here is to guess the exact word. In a clinical setting, you wouldn't necessarily guess the exact word. You wouldn't necessarily repeat the emotion back to them. But the idea is to guess the exact, so if they're angry and someone guesses frustrated, or someone gets even mad, for instance, something very, very close, that's still not the right answer. You have to guess angry. And the point in guessing the exact word is just to show how difficult it really is to align what you're taking from the care receiver and what you're making an assumption about as the caregiver. And then afterwards, and then person A and person B will then go to the back of their lines, but they'll go to the back of the opposite lines. So person A will become person B and person B will become person A, and they'll move up. And so the next time it's their turn, they're taking the opposite role. The next people will come up, they'll do it, and they'll go switch lines, and et cetera, et cetera. And then afterwards, of course, you hold another discussion about how it relates to the theater of spiritual or clinical care, how it relates to that care through the lens of cultural humility. And there's some amazing reflections every time. I often ask them some questions too. What did it feel like when you got it right? What did it feel like when someone guessed your emotion on the first try or guessed it eventually? What did it feel like when you couldn't guess it? When you never guessed it? When no one guessed it? What did it feel like for the person expressing the emotion? What did it feel like for the person guessing the emotion? And things like that. And the conversation continues. That's great because that was a positive emotion, peaceful. And she read it as negative. And so, in that spiritual care situation or in that, patient provider situation, you want to be careful about making assumptions or reading emotions that may be negative that are positive, maybe positive that are negative.
Hello, Jean.
Hello, Janice. You sound rushed.
Hello, Jean.
Hello, Janice. You sound scared.
Hello, Jean.
Hello, Janice. You sound Oh.
Does anyone want to take a guess?
Excited?
Frustrated.
No? Close.
Anxious.
Enthusiastic.
You want to see what it is?
Outraged.
Outraged. You notice how none of the guesses were anywhere close to outrage.
Yeah.
You could interact with someone who's outraged and have no idea.
Hello, Mary. Hello, Christina. You sound exasperated. No. Hello, Mary. Oh, hello, Christina. You sound bored.
Yes. Does anyone have any reflections?
The body language helped.
It helps.
Which even went.
Right. And sometimes when people are sick in a hospital bed, they cannot do any body language.
Made me think that I could imagine myself not like expressing very well through a direct, in that situation, exactly how I was feeling. I mean, that it wouldn't necessarily come across for some things. Well, why is that? Why would a particular emotion be targeted?
Yeah, and not only might you not be able to express what you're feeling because there's so many other things. There's the grief and the trauma. There's so many other things. You may not know how you're feeling either.
Right.
You may be expressing something that you don't even realize you're expressing. And sometimes when the other person guesses it, they may be right and you didn't even know. So.
I was thinking that we may think that we're giving a clear message to someone, and what we think we're showing them is nowhere near what they're really seeing.
Absolutely.
It's just so bizarre.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And there were some emotions that I had a hard time, like, thinking about or recognizing, and then afterwards I realized it's because I don't often see that displayed in people. Like, I'm not in scenarios where I see that often.
Yeah. And someone may be, in a spiritual care situation or even in a hospital in a scenario where they've rarely ever expressed an emotion. They're expressing it for the first time. Well, how did it feel when you guessed it right or when you guessed it wrong? Did you have any different feelings about that?
It's always good to be right.
Yeah, it's always good to be right? Yeah. But how about when you were struggling, when you really wanted to connect with someone? It's a challenge.
Frustrating.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And it's frustrating for the person expressing the emotion and the person trying to understand the emotion. So anyway, this is
And it's difficult with just two words.
right. And
Like outrage, that's hard to express with hello.
right. And that,
Yeah, I could see it. Hello, I'm so
Right.
would be,
but oftentimes when you're in a situation where you're exhausted, you've been in with your family night after night in sleeping in a hospital room, you don't have the energy to say words, but yet you're still outraged, and yeah.
It gets a better meaning to the word
Assuming, yeah. You can make assumptions. Sometimes you have to make assumptions, but you also have to realize that they are assumptions unless the person tells you directly. And even then they may not know how they're feeling.
well, and also some people have a more flat aspect than others.
Yeah.
Just by personality.
Mm-hmm.
They don't express emotionally as easily.
And that could be a cultural thing, and that's where cultural humility comes in. If I lived in Japan for many years where people didn't say things outright necessarily, it was part of the culture, or didn't emote in the same way. So if you're meeting someone from a different culture, you're assuming they're gonna emote the way you do. They're not.
Or people on the spectrum.
Or people on the spectrum, exactly. So another game, and I'm gonna talk about 3 games, but there are a bunch of games, improv games you can do, and you can figure out your own. But these are the ones I usually do if there is time. Another one is called This Is My Partner. So you ask people to pair up in twos, and they can sit wherever. They don't have to be in lines this time. They can sit together in different parts, or they can stand together in different parts of the room or go wherever they want. Person A will talk for 2 minutes or so and you can time that and tell them when to stop, cut them off even if they're in the middle. And they need to share a story about a recent time they were frustrated, a recent frustration. And person B is meant to listen deeply. And you should be very strict about them listening. They don't, and not responding with, I see, not reacting to them, not saying something, I hear you're saying this, just listening deeply. That's the whole point of the exercise. And afterwards, you can also ask, how difficult was it to listen without any response? I mean, it's a very difficult thing. And you don't necessarily, in a clinical setting, you would be saying, I see, possibly. But the point is here to really focus on the listening. And so we're not, it's a more extreme exercise. And just to show how difficult and how much practice is needed to truly deeply listen. Then you'll ask for a group or 2 or 3 to volunteer. And so when a group volunteers, you want to ask the person who was listening this question. What did the person talking to you, what did they value? You're not asking what the story was. Oftentimes people will be listening for the story and the details and the facts of it. You're asking them, what did they value? And you don't want to ask them this question beforehand. You don't want to prepare them. Because the point is, were they listening enough to hear what this person values? And then in a few words, they'll talk about what the person values based on that story. And then you'll go on to the next volunteer group and then the next one, etc. And then you'll have a discussion again about care in this setting through the lens of cultural humility. So person B, who is the listener?
I was listening.
Okay, so the question I'm going to ask you, in a few words, what does your partner value?
My partner values being responsible as a member of the human race, and my partner values nature and its place in the world and our place in nature.
Awesome. Did he get it?
That's well spoken.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, my partner values responsibility
Responsibility.
and knowing how to deal with her own clients or trainees in a way that was different than another person.
Did they get it? Mm-hmm. Awesome. Anyone else? John?
My partner values stability and a job in which he truly enjoys, as opposed to having to compromise and worry about finances and stuck in a position that does not suit.
Awesome. Is that good? Yes. And once again, you can offer questions like, what did it feel like when the person really heard you? Was that what you were valuing? Did you communicate that to them? Did they get that? Did they say something that you were valuing that you were valuing that you didn't realize that you were valuing? And think some people will think, oh wow, that is really what I was communicating. I didn't think about that. So ask some questions like that. So the reason, you may have thought I was going to ask what the story was. But when we're deeply listening, we're not necessarily listening for this. We are listening to the story. We're listening to what the other person values. We're listening for what the other person is trying to communicate with that story. So how did you all feel who answered A, when you realized the person actually heard you?
It's interesting that none of the words that he used would have been words I used to describe my situation, but that he was able to identify the context or the underlying meaning of it.
And isn't that powerful when someone hears you in a way that you wouldn't have even known they heard you? But sometimes, someone brings up something that you told them that you're like, yeah, I really was thinking that. I didn't realize I was communicating that, but I really was communicating. That's powerful. Yeah.
It felt strange,
Yeah.
especially in this in the UU world, to have somebody immediately say something that I said in semi-confidence. Understanding that was part of the exercise,
Right.
It felt a little odd.
Right. Oh, no, completely. And especially in a group of people. But imagine it was just the two of you and you really wanted to communicate to someone and they spoke back to you what you were really feeling and they showed you that they were deeply listening to you. I mean, and just in confidence. And that deeply listening is difficult, especially, you're a medical professional or a chaplain and you have 7 other patients to see in that hour and you're doing a surgery and you were up all night. To stop and deeply listen to someone, that's difficult. Yeah.
Is it better to give them eye contact while you're listening? I was struggling with knowing whether to look at her or to look away and just focus on listening. But I didn't want her to think I wasn't listening if I wasn't looking at her. But then looking at her, I can't nod my head or anything. I'm just like feeling a little creepy.
Yeah. That's a great question. What do people think about that? Is it yeah?
I belong to another organization where we do deep listening.
Yeah.
It's part of our tradition. And it was interesting, when we were face to face in meetings, it was very hard and we did try to maintain eye contact. When we went to Zoom during COVID, all of a sudden you can mute yourself. You
Right.
can turn your video off. And so the dynamic changed
Yep.
of what the deep listening looked like. And what we found is we all got a little sloppy in terms of, oh, I forgot to mute, and they could hear me making, yeah. And whereas when you're face to face, you don't do that. Also listening without any judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very difficult because honestly, and that's part of it is, the vulnerability that Amy, you expressed is thinking about your own biases, your own vulnerability, your own judgment, because there always will be that. You have to recognize that you're judging because you won't always not be judging. Wow, was that like a triple negative thingy? I don't know. But you will always, to some extent, be judging, and you have to recognize that you are. To answer your question, it's about looking in the eyes. It's an assessment of the situation that you learn over time, and you don't always learn it perfectly. But you can tell when someone is uncomfortable that you're looking them in the eyes, and especially if it's a patient who's opening up to you, then you stop doing that and you signal them that you're listening in other ways. You acknowledge, no, I hear you, and repeat back what they're saying, or something like that. Some people want to connect. Really, you can see them connecting with you when you look in the eyes. So it's an assessment in each situation, I think.
And
Yeah.
that's another cultural.
And that's another cultural thing, yeah.
Where people don't want to,
Yeah.
and another neurodiversity.
Yeah, and part of cultural humility too is knowing that before you go in sometimes. If you're meeting a patient and you know what culture they come from, now you can't make an assumption that they follow those cultural rules, but you can study the culture beforehand and try and understand to some extent what you might be confronting. The next exercise is called Time Traveler, and they can stay in groups of 2 or they can move to different groups of 2, however you want to do it. Usually I have people get up and switch partners. The first person will then, and they can assign who the person A and person B is. Person B will talk about a modern convenience, a microwave, an airplane, a TV, internet, whatever it is. But they'll describe it in the language of the 18th century. And because supposedly the person they're talking to only understands the language of the 18th, what happens in the 18th century. They live in the 18th century. They don't understand. So if it's a cell phone, they're going to explain a cell phone to someone in the 18th century. And give them a few minutes. Once again, they can start talking. You can cut them off before they finish. It's fine. And then when the group reconvenes, once again, You will talk to a few of the people who were being explained to. You'll ask for volunteers, and you will ask them what was the convenience. So don't tell me, don't guess it's a cell phone. Tell me what it was in the language of the 18th century. And they'll do that, in their own words. What was it? And then you'll go into a discussion, and the discussion here is kind of obvious. It's really, you can ask people, why do you think we did this exercise? And it's because oftentimes a medical professional or spiritual care provider will communicate a concept or the description of a surgery that's needed or something that really only a professional would understand and a patient won't. And not only do you have to communicate that to someone who doesn't understand or hasn't studied medicine, for instance, but you have to communicate in a way that takes into account culture and race and identity and realities and resources and things like that. You have to take those things into account. You can ask the participants, did you really take that into account, or did you just assume that the other person knew what you knew and felt the same way about, society as you did? How did you parse communicating that thing to them? Did you take into account their identity? And you can ask them other kinds of questions too. How difficult was it? Did you get the idea right away? Can you guess what the object was?
I've tried to find language. So imagine, we're talking to each other. So just as we
Are we supposed to guess what it is?
Not necessarily, just listen.
I'm hundreds, thousands of miles and it kind of looks like it's on camera, right?
Whether you hold it up to your ear, and then you'll hear the voice coming out of it.
What sort of
Went to hear George Washington give a speech, and he was standing up on the stage, and he'd be talking to
In a setting where we're training medical professionals or spiritual caregivers, why might something like this be good to practice, especially when we're medical professionals? Yeah?
Because a regular person would understand medical terminology. You give them a bunch of
Exactly.
gobbledygook. They're gonna stare at you and go, what the,
Exactly. And I can't tell you how many times that a medical professional gave them the medical gobbledygook and the other person just felt out of respect to say, okay, I get it. And they probably didn't get it.
It forces the person talking this exercise to put themselves in the shoes of the other person.
How would they understand what you're saying? I mean, I was thinking of like a, something like a phone or a cell phone, but I had to think, so what would that be to somebody that had no concept of that at all?
Yeah.
I was thinking, well, if you heard somebody giving a speech, but it's like they were right next to you, and you could hear them, but they were thousands of miles away.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. What else might you need to consider if you were actually in 1776? Yeah?
This experience was kind of interesting. At first, she was trying to describe to me this thing that she was a housewife in 1776, and she wanted this thing to make her life easier.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it didn't exist, and she was describing it to me. But as she talked, what came out was her frustrations with her life, her frustrations with her family, with her husband, with the role that a woman had to play. A role of society gave women.
Yeah.
All of that came out of her trying to describe this thing, just this one thing that she would like to have. Yet she knew that her society would shun her if they knew she wanted it.
Yeah, when we think about something, we think about it in our terms, how we relate to it. And so when you're communicating it to another person, you have to consider how you relate to it, but also how the other person might relate to it too. And that's an identity issue too. If you're a man talking about something that a woman needed in 70 or would have dealt with in 1776, and you're talking to a woman, you're going to consider in a very from a very different perspective. The other thing I was trying to talk about is consideration of identity. There has to be a sensitivity. You may not understand it, but you have to really listen for those things in your communication. And also when you're communicating, you don't want to necessarily be insulting and dumbing something down. But at the same time, they don't understand necessarily what you're saying. They may speak a different language than you altogether. That's what this is. We, in Children's Hospital, we often had to communicate. There were many, many Spanish speakers there, and I don't speak Spanish. So I had to communicate through either a live translator or through a video translator, which was really, really difficult. Anyway, what I'd like to ask is, can I ask the person who heard the explanation to tell me what the thing, you don't need to guess what it was, but explain in your own words sort of what, the thing was that the other person was talking about.
Talking to somebody in East Coast here in Boston.
Yeah.
I'm talking to someone in London. Like right at that moment, rather than a letter going there and taking 2 or 3 months to get there and taking 2 or 3 months to get a letter back. I could hear their thought about what I wanted to say right then.
So you got what he was talking about, but it's not something you could have conceived possible. So it's sometimes we're listening, hearing something that we don't understand how it could possibly work, but we have to believe the person that that's what's happening. It's a struggle.
He was talking about a preposterous way in which pictures could come over a electrical wire like Benjamin Franklin proved.
A kite wire.
A kite wire. That they could travel down this kite wire, voices and pictures. And it seemed preposterous that I said, wouldn't it catch on fire, these letters that came down?
There's some simpler improv exercises too. There's the mirror exercise where you're copying another person's movements, and then you, without deciding who's the leader and who's the follower, you both start making movements organically and following each other, and the leader and the follower switch. That's a good one to do and to talk about. There's a number of improv exercises you can do here, simple and more complex. Then I go back to the table, sit down with a paper and pencil, and we go back into the narrative medicine part. And in this completing part, I usually just give people another prompt. In a spiritual care setting, I'd ask them earlier what they consider divine, and I might ask them this time, what would you sacrifice for what you consider divine? And once again, they write down, or you can give them a prompt, the prompt of how have you grown? What have you learned? How do you feel differently from the beginning of this workshop to the end? That's another good prompt. Once again, you'll facilitate that discussion, talking about how it relates to healthcare or spiritual care through the lens of cultural humility. Finally, a more complex narrative medicine exercise I do, if the group is up to it and there's time allowing, is I will give every other person a topic, and I will have something related to caregiving. So life, death, frustration, diagnosis, relief, things like that. And I will give every other person usually an opposite. So if I give someone life, I'll give the other person anger. If I give someone death, I'll give the other person love. And the first person will have a few minutes to write anything they want on that on that topic. And people don't tell each other what their topics are. And so every other person will write first, and then I'll ask some people, and hopefully everybody will read their poem, but they don't have to. I'll ask some people to read what they wrote without telling anybody what their topic was. And then I'll hand that paper to the second person. And the idea here is the second person has to then spend a few minutes finishing what the first person wrote. They have to read again what the first person wrote, take that into account, and not knowing what the first person subject was, and then use their subject, the second person subject, to complete the poem, taking into account what the first person wrote and their subject. So it's really an exercise in really paying attention to validating and accepting the truth of another person, what they wrote, how they communicated, and at the same time understanding your own values and your own biases and your own story enough to write something in addition to give to what the person wrote, without neglecting what they wrote, but while adding your input. And they finish the story. And it's a little bit complex, but when it works really well. And then afterwards, you'll ask each group to read the whole thing, what the first person wrote and what the second person wrote, and you'll ask them each to tell what their subject was. So if it's a poem about love and death or something like that, you can see how those two different subjects flow together with two different people writing about, and finishing what each other wrote.
It wasn't too bad.
You connect, something comes.
Once I wrote the first word down, then it just kind of flowed.
So for the people who responded with a different theme, what did you feel about doing that?
It felt nice to be able to wrap up something.
Yeah.
To give it a conclusion, to a reason for being.
Awesome.
Same, yeah. I felt the same way. Is that I felt like I could continue what was started and concluded.
Awesome.
When you first gave me the word, I thought it would be difficult, but then as I started writing, it just kind of made
Right.
sense.
And that's a lot of people encounter too sometimes, is that it's daunting to think about doing that, but then once you read the other person's and you really take that in and you start, it starts coming. So I'd like to read them. So this is your poem. Mary, you wrote first and Janice, you wrote second. Mary, what was your theme?
Frustration.
Frustration. What was your theme?
Life.
Life. Can you read it all together as one?
Yes. Frustration seeds the mind with anger and makes you tense and give you pain. And the irritability to ease the pain makes you frustrated. At times, and then mine was, at times it feels like we're on a roller coaster, feeling off balance, unable to make sense of things around us.
Awesome. And next it was Dale and Pat, or?
Right.
Thank you. What were your themes?
My theme was sickness.
And
Satisfaction.
awesome.
Shall I read it?
Yeah.
Satisfaction. Maladies, not being well, handicapped. Simple things are more difficult. Reliant on others. Reliant on medication. Apprehension about the future. Accepting what has changed. Accepting what might have to change. The peacefulness that comes from being cared for. Having loved ones around. Resting more.
Awesome. That's awesome. And I just want to reiterate, because I don't know if I was recording before, but Pat, you were saying that it felt good to finish something too.
Yeah, it really felt good to be able to bring something complete.
Completely. Oh, awesome. Thank you. And Jean and
Fran.
Yeah.
What were your themes?
Fear and courage.
Fear and courage.
My nemesis that I need to invite to tea, to sit down with me, to face it, know it, welcome it, so that it no longer controls me. Otherwise, it can become insidious, not only separating ourselves from our true selves, but separating neighbors, states, nations, causing division, leading to war, hatred. But it's all because we don't know, because we didn't learn how to face it. When we have the courage to fight back, it makes the world change. Gathered together, others of like mind, search for the truth. Then we have enough to take action. We abandon fear and fight for a cause and change the world as our legacy.
Awesome. Thank you. Death.
Love.
And love.
A release from suffering, a release from cares and woes, an end to the story, a hopeful exhalation of a last breath. The memory of a joyful connection, the memory of care given and hugs received, the start of a new life, the loving embrace of a final touch.
Awesome. Thank you. And then did we didn't read yours, right?
Not yet.
Okay. So what were your themes?
What was yours? Grief.
Grief.
Grief, and I think mine was happiness.
Yep.
Okay. So that poem is love overflow, anger, new routines, pain of loss, uncertainty, annoyance, and love. Love flows over, happiness, familiar habits, exhilaration, confidence gained, calm nights and serene days, love.
Thank you. And any comments about, the exercise itself?
It seems like whoever wrote the first part, the other part was trying to give them more encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an honorable thing to do.
Awesome.
I think that each passage that was written was a demonstration of the overall healing process that a person goes through when they have some sort of ailment or frustration in life.
Yeah. And it is, regardless, I purposely made the themes opposite. And maybe next time I do it, I can switch it around with the good one first and the bad one second. But I made them opposite. And yet you came up with a cohesive, overlapping story, something that, like you said, you put a period on. But had you written on that theme without reading the other person's poem, it would have been probably different. Part of the exercise was thinking about someone else's story and someone else's relationship to whatever they're feeling and taking that into account before you start responding. That's the whole idea.
I just thought it was interesting how we all approached it. I mean, I guess I wasn't listening.
That's okay.
Which is part of the course. But the way I think is very much what I do. When I'm brainstorming something, words come to my mind.
Yeah.
And I just write the words down. And then later on I will expand on them, which is exactly what Christina did.
Yeah.
She took the words I wrote and put them into a narrative that made sense.
And that's the important part, taking the words you wrote, really respecting what you wrote, and then continuing.